Hello and welcome to the final episode for the Expressive Watercolor Portraits unit. I am going to show you how to begin the final project. I am excited for you guys to try this out because it's combining all of the skills that we've been practicing into one awesome piece of art. Now you are going to need 2 copies of both of your portraits, so make sure you've got 2. You're gonna grab a piece of watercolor paper which is 6 by 9, and as you are getting ready, you're going to choose one of your pieces of paper, and this is the one you're going to use as the hinged picture on our watercolor paper that we are tracing. Now, you are going to start by looking at your image and thinking, are there any edges where if I had this a little lower, I wouldn't know what to put there? So if your photo has an edge, it's nice to just place your paper along that edge to make sure that you don't have to come up with your own details. You are going to choose where you want your image, and I didn't want to lose this front section of flowers, so I'm going to scooch that to the side a smidge and line it up with the bottom edge of my reference photos side section, and then I'm going to go through and trace this with a pencil. Now we are going to go through and cut this out, and I would like for you to be aware that the watercolor paper that we are using has a correct side to work on. Both of the sides are slightly bumpy on our watercolor paper, but one side is bumpier. And that is really helpful for watercolor because those little divots help the water from spreading too much. It kind of keeps it where you want it. Now we've got our reference photo. Mine needs to be on the bottom because that's where my edge is, and we're going to take a piece of masking tape and create a hinge so that we can lift and lower this to see how it's going. So we only tape along one side. Now I'm just going to place this along the edge. I'm going to make sure I don't have my watercolor paper sticking out here, and I'm going to place this down and just smooth it out so that I don't get any bumps from the picture being kind of bubbled. I'm going to flip it over and just fold that down. There we go. I would like for you, while you're doing this, to put your name and your period and your table color so that you don't have to worry about doing that after you've started painting. Now we have this on a hinge, which is really great. You are going to go collect a piece of carbon paper. The side that's darker is the side that goes down. Now, when you're working, you want to make sure that the bumpier side is face up because that's where your watercolor is going to go. We want to place our carbon paper with the darker side down. So bumpier side face up, darker side face down, and we just sandwich it underneath our picture. Now, what's really cool is I can take a pencil and I can go around and I can trace exactly, and it's really neat because when you lift this up, it is an exact copy. And so for all of these areas that are white, we are going to go through and outline it. And then we are going to show ourselves where that background space is kind of starting so that we know this will be black. Now you do not need to fill this all in. That would take forever and would be not that much more helpful than what we're doing. So we are outlining all of the black, and we are looking for precise, tiny little details. Try to transfer everything because the more you transfer, the less you have to come up with on your own. So show yourself all of the details and where they are so you don't have to decide where they are and where they go. So just give yourself as much information as possible to make it easier on yourself as you are filling in your pen layer. Now, when we come across something that's a sharp, crisp edge, we draw right up against it. But if we have a value fade where it's going from dark to medium to light, then you need to give yourself first the border where the white dots are starting to show up so that you can say, okay, this is where it starts solid black, and then it starts to get lighter and fade out to medium, and then come in with some little tiny marks and show yourself exactly where it fades out so that you have not only where the black starts, but where you're fading to. You are able to come in and just kind of show yourself some of the extra little dots that you would add for your light layer as you finish that up. So if it's a sharp, crisp edge, like here, we've got a sharp, crisp edge, I copy it exactly. If we have a value fade, like right here, I'm gonna show myself where I can start with solid black, and then I'm gonna show myself with little dash marks the exact place where those values fade out. So you can see we've got sharp, crisp edge, value fading edge. Now, once you've gone through and got all of your details, I want you to lift your picture and compare it with your extra reference photo. And that's the reason why we have two, is because when we're looking at our picture, we can't see our reference photo. So we need to have that second image to compare and make sure that we've got all the details we need. Now that does take a little bit of time. I've got this one pre-drawn out so that I can get started on the next step with you to show you the order before you begin. At this point, you need to check and make sure you've got all of your details, and then we begin the watercolor layer. So I would like to remind you that you've got all of the brush options in your corner of the block. So let's go ahead and pull those out. Remember that the size of the brush is really kind of what determines which brush you should use. We've also got our watercolor cup and our paper towel to use for drying off. Now, the only watercolor technique that is absolutely required is gradient. And you guys have already done a little practice of that for our skill building that looks like this. We have our flat wash where you continuously load your brush with more paint to keep it consistent. And then we had gradient where we loaded our brush with paint just once and we're slowly removing it out of our paintbrush to then paint to clear water. Now that's the only one that's absolutely required, and I suggest thinking about where it would work well for your project. Now, before you actually begin your painting, you must choose your color scheme for each portrait, and you can have a different color scheme for your first than you have for your second, but all of the colors that you use in just this one picture need to be included in your color scheme. You'll have the option to look at this color scheme menu, which is really helpful to see the basic concepts of what these look like together. But of course, there's a lot of variations in the color tone, so you are welcome to look in my color cube document and the actual physical color cubes to look at the cards and the options of color schemes in there, because they are a little bit more original as far as the tone and hue of the colors there. Now, once you've decided on your color scheme, which I think I'm going to use analogous, and you should know that you do not have to use all of the colors to make it analogous. In fact, I would like to use the analogous combo of warm and cool, but I don't think I want the blue. So I think I'm just going to use purples, reds, and oranges to create my piece, and that's the color scheme I'm choosing. I'm just eliminating one of the analogous colors. Now, as I am thinking about where I'm going to place things, I first will look and say, okay, where are my value fades? Because we've got this value fade right here where we've got the solid black and then it's fading to medium and then lighter. So that might be a good place to start in my gradient wash because I have to include it, and that is actually a place where it transitioned naturally. So that might be a good option for me. Now I am going to get started, and I'm just going to show you a couple of the things that you can do as you're working on your watercolor. Let me grab my paint palette. All right, I am going to just set this right off to the side. We've got my picture here so I can kind of see where the colors are changing, so where it goes from dark to medium to light. Now, like I said, I'm working with purples, reds, and oranges, and since this is kind of coming out from a really dark area, I think I'm gonna choose some of the darker colors, like maybe a purple, to do this gradient wash with, and I'm going to swipe along the actual palette cake quite a lot to mix the color up with the water to make it nice and consistent. Now I'm going to paint along this edge. It's a little quick, so we're gonna do a stroke of paint, and I'm gonna go dip in the water, dab on the paper towel. Stroke, dip in my water, kind of wiggle it around so I can fade faster, dip on or dab on my paper towel, and I'm dabbing quite a lot to help this fade a little quicker. And then I'm gonna dip in my water, really kind of swirl it around, dab on my paper towel quite a lot. We wanna dry this up. And then we're just stroking all the way out. And I am gonna continue with clean water all the way out so that it doesn't have a stop line when it dries. Now it's okay that this overlapped into the black section because I'm going to just cover that with pen later on, so it doesn't really matter that I have kind of an abrupt stop right there. So I've got my edge with my purple coming in, so I can kind of think to myself, do I wanna use this color scheme based on like the values, the dark colors representing the medium colors from my color scheme, which would be like red representing the medium and orange representing light? Or do I want to assign sections so that I'd have, and I could have done this differently. I could have made the skin orange since that's maybe closer to like a human color. I could add purple for the hair, and then maybe I would choose like red for the flowers. So you can kind of choose it object by object, or you can do it value by value. Now I'm just gonna, I think, do value by value. So I am going to come in now and let's add in, I think I'm gonna do some red for the hair. So I am going to come in here and just kind of start adding some, and this is where it's gonna be black. So I am gonna help that to go out into that space. I guess maybe I'll just kind of like cover this section. Let's try that. Now I am going to incorporate a couple of different watercolor techniques for you to see how they can work. First, I am going to try out some Brusho crystals, and I'm going to go up and collect this before I actually paint the water so that it doesn't dry out. And then I can take one of my colors. Oops, I'm gonna go and grab the right set because these are not pierced yet. I'll be right back. So you should definitely do this while you have dry paper, so you're not letting it dry out, because you definitely need the water to be wet still for this to work. Now I'm gonna take this violet one because it's part of my color scheme, and I'm just gonna drop and just tap, tap, tap. Ooh, that's fun. And then it just kind of like spreads and grows. Ooh, that's pretty. Okay, now maybe I am going to come in and maybe I'll use some more purples to kind of like fade out. Maybe I'll do a little bit of purple like on my eyelid, and I'm going to try to incorporate some more color throughout the neck. Even though it's really dark in my image, there's not much that shows. I'm gonna try to show a little bit more here. So let's come in with some orange, and I'm going to add that here. And this is a fun one. I think it's very recognizable and visible to the viewer, so that's a benefit of this technique. But I am going to snag with this eyedropper some rubbing alcohol. And I'm going to just take a tiny bit. I'll walk back to my table with it up like this so I'm not dribbling this all across the floor. And then I'm just gonna add a couple dots, and I'm gonna try to hit it in the spots that will really be visible. And maybe a couple more. There we go. Now we want to try to fill a large portion of this with our watercolor paint before we come in for our pen layer. Now we want to get very expressive, and something that I find fun to add are some drips. So I'm going to grab some orange. Gonna try to balance that out from that bottom section. I'm just gonna add like an orange line, kind of starting at the top, and then I'm gonna start some drips where I want them, because I want them to kind of frame my guy for composition. And I'm gonna add just a little blob of water to the bottom of each of those lines. And then I'm just going to tilt my paper up. Now the rest of my watercolor might come along with this, so I have to be extra careful not to let it do more than what I want. So if you are not wanting the rest of your watercolor to drip while you do this step, then maybe wait till it's dry. Now I am just gonna come in and kind of force these drips to go where I want them to. It's very controlled, and I'm gonna let this one get a little longer, and maybe just like a little bit more on that guy. Let's let that drip down. Ooh, yes. Okay, so I'm gonna set that flat and I'm gonna let it just kind of dry in that position. Now there's some drips. I also really love it when students incorporate splatter, especially outside of the actual face. I think it's very expressive. It goes along really well with our concept. Now I loaded my brush. I'm gonna get even more paint on it because the more you have, the easier it is for this step to make it work. I'm gonna set my hand down with my finger just a little bit above. I'm just like adding a couple little like splatters. Ooh, I just realized that is kind of murdery. Maybe I won't splatter with red. Okay, now let's do some pink instead. I didn't mean to make it look like I am murdering this man. But let's add some pink splatters. I really love having different sizes of splatters. So maybe I'll take my bigger brush, which can hold more watercolor paint. I'm going to grab a color and I'm going to use a lot of water so that I get a bigger splat, so I have multiple sizes of splats. And I'm just gonna, ooh, that was a big one. Fun. Ooh, that is really pretty. I love it. Okay, so we're adding some splats. We're getting really expressive with our stuff here. I am gonna go through and make sure that all of your white space that's showing in your image is filled in with watercolor. So I'm leaving some areas white intentionally, like these highlights, but I don't need to leave a ton of white. We want most of it to be filled in. And I'm gonna just take a look at my guy's lips while I'm doing this to make sure I'm not like doing it into spaces that should be left white. I can always come back with a gel pen to add some white back in. And I'm gonna try to define the section between his lips, even though I don't actually see that in my reference photo very much. So I'm just kind of bringing in some of this purple while it's wet, and I'm letting it fade out into the space above and below it, just to kind of give it some value. Now you'll notice as you are watercoloring that when oh geez, that was a bit too much. So when something like that happens, which actually I don't know that I hate that, I kind of like that the red is still on the outside, but you can take a paper towel and just like soak up if you ever have a space that's like, whoa, that was too much. So we are just going through, we're looking at our reference photo while we are painting, and I'm just gonna go through and use my gradient wash to make these like real soft fades to have a nice transition out. So I'm gonna really quickly clean my brush almost all the way. And then I'm gonna use this kind of like dried off brush to then help fade it out really quick into that space where it's fading. And I can bring in a little bit more to kind of like outline these sections. So we're really just going through and adding in our values, trying to leave some white spaces when they are going to be beneficial to our design. Now we are not perfect here. We are not trying super hard to stay inside the lines. It is very expressive, and that's on purpose. So we really want to keep it looking expressive. So as you're working, don't try to make it too perfect, but we are trying to like show some of the values. So if there's like a way that you can show that something is like getting darker, like I know this is gonna be black, but I added some red to show that this is kind of like fading out from that dark area. So I am going to go through and fill in all of these spaces with my watercolor, and then my next step is to come in for my pen layer. Now we want to make sure before though that you have at least 6 visible watercolor techniques, which should be doable because you've got 12 to choose from. You also have a couple different types of paint that you can add in before I move on. You are able to go over and collect some of the metallics. I think that turns out really cool sometimes, just to add like a little stroke of that. Gosh, maybe I'll use it for some of my like flower painting, or maybe I'll use it to come in to like add some, ooh, that's kind of a thicker splat. Ooh, that looks fun on top of the red. Oh my gosh. Oh. It's just like such wonderful surprises when you're doing this. So you are welcome to use the metallic paint as well. You should see a recognizable, visible 6 techniques. So right now I have splatter, I have brusho, I have drip, I have gradient, and that's 4. So maybe I would come in with toothbrush, maybe I would add some salt maybe, oh, and I had my rubbing alcohol. It's just not very visible, so I don't think I would count that one. So I would say rubbing alcohol typically shows up best when you use a darker color. So let's come in for like the bottom of this flower here, and I am going to do that same thing with my rubbing alcohol, and you can see that it's gonna be a lot more visible with it being in a darker color. So I am just gonna add that, let that dry. So now you can see I'm up to 5 and I just need 1 more. Remember that flat wash does not count as one of the effect techniques. Now, after you have finished watercolor, I want you to check your watercolor layer with me so that I can make sure that you've got everything that you need before you start on your pen layer, because the pens will spread, their ink spreads with the water touching it. Not the Sharpie necessarily as much, but the V5 and ballpoint spread and make everything really dark and gray if you add water to them. So be careful that you've got all of your techniques added and finished before you move on. From here, you are going to switch into the pen layer, and we want to have, and notice that like this was white in the image, but the pop through is just to a color, so that's a cool option. We start with our thicker pens and then work our way to our skinnier pens and then to our ballpoint to add in value. We don't need this to be super precise. Notice that I added in different textures of value for different areas just to kind of make it more interesting. And there are parts that I just chose to leave out. Notice I also went very outside the lines on this, and I think that is a fun thing because it's so often the opposite and you feel very like controlled and restricted, but this is just like you get to be free, and I hope you really enjoy it. Now, as you are working on the pen layer, have your extra photo out and looking back and forth to make sure that you're matching those values to your reference photo. And as you are working, you are able to bounce between your pictures and do one and then go to the other. For either the watercolor layer or the pen layer, you can bounce between the two, which is sometimes nice. Now, I hope that you have just the best time making these. I know I certainly do. I think it's really fun. So if you have any questions at all, I want you to come and ask me, because I want you to enjoy this and to feel the freedom, and I am just so excited for you guys to try it. So enjoy. Thank you so much for watching.